So thanks everybody for joining. Let me just begin by introducing Karen Mundy. Professor Karen Mundy is the director of the Unesco Institute for Education and Planning and the professor of educational policy and leadership at the University of Toronto. She is a leading expert on education in the developing world and a former chief technical officer at the Global Partnership for Education. She's held positions as the Canada Research Chair, Associate Dean of Research and Innovation, and President of the Comparative and International Education Society. And she's authored dozens of books and articles and chapters. So we're absolutely thrilled to have her here today in a live lecture to talk to us about the international aid architecture. Karen, thank you very much for making time and being with us.
Well, thank you. And really a pleasure to be here, and I hope to have a little bit of an exchange, not just a canned lecture. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. And at the end of the lecture, we'll have plenty of ideas, a time to share some ideas, and also I'll be glad to respond to your questions. So let me just get started. So today we're going to talk about something big and lofty at the global level, the international aid architecture for education. At the end of the lecture, I'm looking forward to having Professor Faisal and Professor Rabea talk a little bit about how this architecture works in the context of Pakistan. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the historical evolution first of this architecture, and about two ways of thinking about the role or value overall of international actors in education first, and that'll be the first part of the lecture. And then the second part, we'll take a look at some of the recent empirical work showing trends, areas of concentration, some of the pathologies of the current architecture. And we'll end the whole lecture by talking a little bit about, well, what does this architecture mean when it comes for addressing this decades-long challenge of universalizing literacy. So let me begin. I always like to start with a few pictures so you can see me a little bit more in action. Just get to see a little headshot here, but you'll see me working as a patron of CAMFED, an organization for girls' education across Africa, lecturing, and in fact, lecturing on this topic. I have in many places given two-day workshops, and this is me in Barcelona. And then, of course, when I was at the last day of my term as CTO at the Global Partnership for Education. And I guess one thing that probably characterizes my career, and I like to share that with students, is that I've always gone in and out of academic research roles and professional roles. I started my career as a teacher in rural Zimbabwe just after Zimbabwe's independence. I worked for several NGOs while doing my master's and PhD programs. I became instantly fascinated from those experiences with what the international architecture would be that would place young people from the global north in the global south as a teacher. And that was sort of the start of my curiosity. And you've seen a little bit about that career trajectory in one of the articles for today, which was the presidential lecture I gave for the Comparative Education Society, and which was very autobiographical. So you've seen a little bit about this. But let's start just an overview of what we're going to do, the aid architecture and its evolution. We'll talk about that in the first part, and then we'll talk a little bit about what the education aid looks like today. And let me start here, which is really kind of a frame for what we're going to talk about. What is embedded liberalism and what is world order? So a lot of people study international aid as if it's a technical, rational endeavor that has a clear purpose and that is intended to improve education. But when I write about international aid and the international aid architecture, I like to place it within broader theories of world order, that is international relations theory. And one way of understanding international relations theory is to look at sort of two main paradigms for thinking about what gives the world, especially the world of relationships among nation states, its structure. And the main paradigm, the one that dominates, and I think today in the context of the war in Ukraine, seems to have the most purchase, is an understanding of the world order we call realism. Realism imagines the world as a set of nation states. They're a kind of billiard balls. Each of them is trying to get a purchase on their own self-interests. And sometimes they collaborate, but mostly they're always trying to jockey for position. So the world order is structured by a set of almost fixed interests among individual nation states. So that's the classical tradition. You would see this established very well in the work of Morgenthau, in the early writings of Henry Kissinger. He would be perhaps one of the most applied actors of this view of world order. And if you look and if you listen to discussions about almost any conflict in the world, it will mainly be framed as a realist problem. Constructivism is a different framing, and constructivists have for a long time argued that actually cooperation among nations evolves. It evolves through a variety of processes, and that institutions and organizations, including the United Nations, NATO, and others, that these organizations actually create a world in which there is a strong culture, a culture in which nation states are embedded and to which they start to, which in turn changes the way that those actors behave. So this constructivist idea is a sociological theory, a theory of world order that actually gives a lot of attention to these intermediate institutions, including actors in the aid architecture, as possible levers for bringing nation states into new ways of behaving. Now, you might think at the beginning that realists are all about war and power and constructivists are all about values and ideals. That's not quite the case, because constructivists over time have developed a very strong body of sociological research at the organization and institutional level, talking about the way in which individual organizations in world order, like UN agencies, like the World Bank, like the IMF, how these organizations themselves have internal organizational pathologies that actually perpetuate not a positive or not a enriched culture, but rather create additional pathologies in the way that nations and governments organize themselves to collaborate. So it's not intended to be realism versus idealism, but rather realism versus this thicker social order that in which states sit and which shapes their interests. So that over time, we should imagine that nation states' interests are not fixed, but they change over time. So here you have a little bit of a picture of course, the Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm going to go now to this sort of foundational idealist foundations for the present aid architecture and looking at what happened after the Second World War. And I want to use this term embedded liberalism. And what is that? It is really this notion that after the Second World War, countries, nation states from around the world, of course, heavily weighted towards the West, emerged with an alliance and a set of institutions that were intended to create a liberal world order, and world order in which democracy became the highest normative value for the way states would be organized internally, and free market capitalism would be the way in which the international system itself organized the world economy. And the idea here was also that international organizations would play a very strong role in setting normative values and securing this liberal order. And of course, we know that that was far from perfect, but still that was the social imaginary of the time. And at this time, and remember, after the Second World War, there was a lot of reconstruction to do. The idea that aid or official development assistance, it didn't really exist as a form of action in the world order, but it was just getting started, but that sometimes money would be needed to address both immediate need, but also to rebuild nations after war or crises. And of course, the Marshall Plan was the hallmark of that just very early period in the international architecture. I like to just give you a little overview of some of these normative and institutional foundations that were formed at the time, at the end of the Second World War, and then that evolved up into the 60s and 70s. And I think the first thing is I like people to always take a look at the United Nations Charter. And the reason for this is that it's a kind of interesting document insofar as it slays a kind of conceptual foundation for differentiating education from other aspects of international cooperation. So this is the part of the Charter, Chapter 9, that deals with international economic and social cooperation. It starts with a view to the creation of conditions of stability and well-being that are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations among nations based on the principle of equal rights. The United Nations job is to promote, of course, first and foremost, higher standards of living, full employment, and conditions of economic and social progress. And then secondly, solutions of international economic, social, health, and related problems. And remember, that list does not include education and international cultural and educational cooperation. And then it goes on to the universal rights and fundamental freedoms. Now, what's going on here? Why this second part of the statement that's focused on international, cultural, and educational cooperation separated from social, economic, and health? Well, it's part of the backdrop of education and the role education plays within the domestic sphere of most governments. And so sometimes we think about, and because we've been very indoctrinated into thinking about education primarily as an economic elevator, a way in which one enhances the human capital of nations. But actually, I think we can argue historically, education has always played a different role, very, very central from, especially a realist worldview, very central to the actual loyalty of citizens to the state. And because it plays that very strong role in nation building and the structuring of nations, at the time of the formation of the United Nations, governments were very hesitant to include educational cooperation as something that we would do jointly. That is, it should be not something that solutions would not be global in scale, that we would not have to all agree on common curricula or a common approach, that this is something that would remain within an area of national sovereignty. So I think this is a really important thing, and we'll return to that challenge for education as we go along. But one thing to say is that it's really made a difference in terms of the education architecture itself over time. So here's the formation of UNESCO. This is the organization that I now work for. And you can see in this slide just some of the phrasing that gives you a sense of how education was going to be treated. First of all, UNESCO's constitution states that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that defenses of peace must be constructed. This lays the foundation for the first global institution for education. I suppose one might say that there were other global institutions involved in education, mainly faith-based organizations for over many centuries that created a kind of global edifice for education across many countries or territories. But really UNESCO, the first one, set up purposively as part of a broader architecture. And the Constitution also states, and if you ever hear somebody talking about education for all, it comes from this Constitution, this charter, that the state parties at that time believed in full and equal opportunities for education for all. And then just to point out, this is the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which you saw Eleanor Roosevelt holding up in an earlier slide. This is the normative framework for global action on education. It has, of course, evolved with many secondary conventions now that include a deeper elaboration of what the right to education means. but this is the original one. And I think it's worth looking at it because it also has internal to it something that from a legal perspective makes education as a right a little hard to implement if you're thinking from a realist point of view. So it starts, everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Technical and professional education shall be made available, and higher education equally accessible on the basis of merit. Now, I don't know if you realize it, but it's a very difficult phenomena to have something that is both free and compulsory. And if you look at the last part of this convention, you'll also see that parents have the prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. And so this right to education isn't, in a way, it preserves a very strong level of first balancing the compulsion to go to school with the right of families to select the kind of education that they want. Again, this last phrasing was obviously intended to protect families from the imposition of forms of education that might indeed, at that time, of course, people were very alert to the indoctrination role that education had played during the Second World War. So after the formation of UNESCO and the UN, we also saw the development of several other organizations within the UN that have an education role. You probably will have known or seen Unicef in action in Pakistan. Even if you haven't seen them in action, you probably saw vehicles with UNICEF branded on the side. It's the United Nations Organization for Children. And that organization really was forged in the aftermath of the Second World War to support refugee populations across Europe. Over time, it became, I think, one of the strongest and biggest partners in education. It has many unique features, including that it is a highly decentralized organization. So unlike UNESCO, which is really centralized in Paris with some field offices, and UNESCO, of course, has always been a very underfunded organization. It relies on assessed contributions from countries. UNICEF actually relies on, it has a variety of streams of resourcing, not only from governments, all voluntary contributions, but also it has open campaigns for funding from the public. So it has that civil society engagement feature that's unique across all the UN organizations. UNDP, the United Nations Development Organization, this is actually an organization that's its footprint in education is quite small, but it tends to play this coordinating role among UN agencies, increasingly so now. The UN UNHCR, which is devoted to education for refugees and involuntary migrants. UN Women, a newer organization which has an education footprint because it focuses on the rights of women to education. And you might not know this, but the World Food Program actually is one of the biggest funders of education through its school feeding programs. And then these are the funds, the programs, they're funds of the UN, and then specialized agencies. And these agencies tend to have more institutional autonomy from the UN itself. UNESCO, of course, the one that I work for, the World Bank or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which has two facilities. One facility is the IBRD. It focuses on providing loans to mainly middle income, lower middle income, and middle income countries. It also has a facility called IDA. IDA is the International Development Association. It focuses its attention on providing grant-based, highly grant-based funding to low-income, fragile, and conflict-affected countries. And the IDA itself, interestingly enough, emerged in the late 60s and early 70s as a compromise in world order, because initially there was a great demand for IDA for a similar facility to sit under the UN proper. and countries in the Western world, because that was the peak of the Cold War, preferred not to have such a facility sit within the UN, which had a stronger representation from the non-Western world, and to sit in the World Bank and to be more of a technical, rational organization. So World Bank became, with the establishment of IDA, the largest and the biggest actor in international economic development within the aid architecture. And it gradually then also began to work on education. At first, the bank worked on education with Unesco. That is, Unesco was the brains, it would provide the technical advice, and the World Bank would provide the money. But by the 1980s, the bank had pretty much taken over dominance intellectually, technically, and in terms of financing for education. That's something that I've written about extensively. I think it's a very fascinating piece of this international architecture. We don't go into detail in it today, but I really invite you to take a look at some of the work that I've done, trying to research and understand the organizational logic of the bank itself. And then the International Labour Organization, which is really focused on labor and trade, but it does have this very strong component on teachers' work. And then the International Monetary Fund, which really has never had an education-specific technical role, but of course, because it helps governments establish the sort of terms under which they get large-scale loans during economic crisis, the IMF ends up shaping the way governments spend on education. And over time, I mean, during the 80s, the 90s, in a way played perhaps the dominant role in shaping the educational reform agenda through structural adjustment programs. Today, the IMF looks a lot more like an actor, an advocate of embedded liberalism, and it tends to emphasize the compensatory role of education in achieving equity, and also the role that education can play in human capital development. So it's the inflection of its work in education has actually deepened or changed over time. One of the ways in which this international architecture evolves is through a series of normative frameworks, or frameworks that are captured over time through international conferences, and through these conferences, a process of goal setting happens at the global level. So we can kind of trace those starting in the 1990s with the World Conference on Education for All at Jomtien, Thailand. This is the period in which the notion of education for all became a rallying cry across the international architecture of organizations working on educational development. Then in 2000, the World Education Forum in Dakar, Senegal, leading to the Dakar Framework for Action. Somewhat, this very expansive set of goals that was agreed led by the education community was somewhat superseded by the Millennium Development Goals, the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. These goals, as I'm going to show you subsequently, were much more narrow in their focus on education. In 2015, then the Sustainable Development Goals, another UN set of goals, this time a little different in inflection, addressing not only sort of lower income and middle income countries, but the whole world. And just to highlight that this year we'll see a kind of midterm review of the Sustainable Development Goals through the UN Secretary General's Transforming Education Summit in September. And countries are now being asked to develop a sort of bespoke set of responses to the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of the post-COVID period. Just to compare a little bit these global goals and also say a few words about, well, and do they really matter? So I think that one thing that if you look across these global goals, you'll see that the aim of achieving universal literacy, that is improving the literacy, especially of children as they go through the school system, has been on the agenda for a very, very long time. In fact, it predates the EFA goals, and we can trace it to early regional conferences held by UNESCO in the 60s and early 70s. But at the time of the establishment of Education for All goals, there really was this notion that universalization of primary education would be achieved by 2005. That goal was missed, but of course later this idea of universalizing primary education was achieved, almost, not completely, but almost achieved. Unfortunately, by the time we realized that universalization of primary education had succeeded, we also realized that actually learning had not been achieved. In other words, the literacy goal that animated so much of the normative framework for education internationally, in a way, was the sort of substance of universalization, which should have been everybody learns, had not been achieved. The Millennium Development Goals were very, very focused. They gave us this lift in a focus on primary education, and also only two goals that have educational inflection, one on primary education and one on gender disparity. A lot of complaints about the MDGs because they were very narrow and they were not very relevant for countries that had already achieved universalization. Even low-income countries were rather upset by the MDGs because they felt that even in low-income countries, a focus on universal primary education avoided or distracted from the need to build solid education systems that had good quality higher education, technical vocational education, etc. And then the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a much larger range of goals intended to apply to all countries. And then with Goal 4, which has an enormous range, it includes, for the first time, a link between access and quality of education in terms of learning outcomes. It has a focus, it has sub-goals and targets related to teachers, related to education quality, related to inclusion, gender equity, related to adult education, higher education, scholarships, etc. So it's a really big agenda. And some people would say that we sort of threw the nice, narrow, precise, dedicated focus on universal primary education of the MDGs out, and we got left with this longer objective that diffuses effort at the global level. That's a big debate, and I don't think we have time to get into it here, but we'll come back to it in a way at the end of the lecture. So what was happening across all of these, this sort of global agenda setting of a feature is underneath it all was emerging this international architecture for education for all. And I think what you would see if you read Giran Bahari's piece or read an earlier piece by Nick Burnett, you will find lots of evidence that it's a very imperfect architecture. So overall, in that architecture, very low levels of funding for education as compared to other sectors, really something between about 8 and 11% of what we call international development assistance, so ODA, is spent on education. When we look at the kinds of things that are spent at the international, or funded through this international architecture, we find that over historical time, the dollars are skewed towards middle income countries. It always has been, and typically skewed towards funding of higher education and scholarships. And I guess we could trace this back to the realist view that there is a geopolitical drive to create political influence through foreign aid, and it's always been more easy to do that through higher education than through basic education. And so this led indeed to limited support for basic education, although that did change in the period of the MDGs. It changed quite a bit. So much more, for the first time, was focused on supporting basic education. Overall, despite lots of effort to coordinate and to make sure at the country level that there's coordination among different actors, that coordination has been flawed. And over time, as compared, we'll see later, to health, in education, there's a lot less use of multilateral channels and a lot more interagency competition. Why does it matter? Well, if we think that foreign aid tends to be shaped by national interests, by the constant seek of nation states, search by nation states for ways in which they can influence and protect their geopolitical power, then bilateral aid by definition will be a more direct route to this than multilateral channels. And indeed, some scholars argue that when we see the transfer of funds from bilateral to multilateral channels, we are also seeing evidence of constructivism and of cooperation and of a pure form of international aid itself. There's a lot of emphasis on how to spend aid money, and over the period between the 60s and today, one of the constant debates has been whether aid should be delivered through projects or large programs, or whether it should actually be delivered using country systems. A big effort was made in the 1990s and early 2000s to use sector-wide approaches to education aid and to use aid that was on budget, not just aligned to national goals, but actually used national systems to deliver the results. And over time, I think this probably trend in using on budget or using national systems to deliver aid to improve education. It reached probably its peak in the mid to late 2000s today, and maybe a reflection of the geopolitical order that I'm about to talk about. Today, that use of project aid is actually on the rise, and the use of multilateral channels has improved a bit over time, but still not the same as in other sectors like health. And one might say that part of the reason, I think, for the fact that education has never been quite as multilateralized as health lies in this originary role of education in creating national citizens, and this tight use of education for cultural influence, winning hearts and minds, that still is important today, even though when you read a report by the World Bank, or when you read a report even by USAID, or when you read Giran Bahari's piece, you would never know that that dynamic of national interest is playing a role, is one of the pathologies of the system. It absolutely is. And then finally, just to say that UNESCO has been completely eclipsed in this global architecture over time. The reason for this is actually geopolitical, because UNESCO has its own general conference, its own, when I walk into UNESCO, I immediately meet ambassadors, because every country has an ambassador to UNESCO, and it became very, very politicized in the 1970s, and it remains very politicized today. So countries are in blocks at UNESCO, and so this creates a lot of sort of geopolitical turmoil for the organization, including the fact that the United Nations has left UNESCO due to a block within the organization that supports Palestine and sanctions Israel. I want to just talk a little bit about this, again, back to this big picture of what's the international order, what do international relations scholars tell us about how this world order has changed, and then how might that affect education aid. So one piece of the story, of course, is that in the 90s and the 2000s, even up to the 2010, this end of the Cold War reshaped in a way international order, but also it reshaped international aid. It saw the rise of international actors from the private sector and civil society, often these organizations starting to play really major roles in shaping the work of what used to be nation state driven international bodies. So all UN agencies today are much more integrated with different kinds of advisory bodies or initiatives that bring the private sector and civil society into their governance structures and into their decision-making processes. We can almost say that we ended up with a much more robust global governance system, more networked, without this high focus on the United Nations and this integration of nation states in common dialogue tables. Now what we see is much more diverse dialogue tables, a lot more happening. And of course, technology's made the ability, the thickness of international society advanced very quickly, because there could be many ways of organizing and creating new sort of social constructs or organizational constructs alongside these traditional actors. One of the things that wasn't anticipated, I still remember, my first course as a graduate student was right at the end of the fall of the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think at that time, everyone, we read Francis Fukuyama, and he said, well, this is the end of history. We're just going to live in an increasingly liberal world order. Countries will become more democratic and peace will flow and the world economy will integrate. Unfortunately, of course, that actually didn't happen quite the way Fukuyama thought. There was certainly a period of rapid liberalization of the world economy and rapid political liberalization among nation states, but it also then turned out to be quite short-lived in some regions and also very turbulent. And then just to say that this consensus that grew in the 90s and 2000s that, okay, we should have multilateral aid, and our effective aid means collaborating at the country level, using country systems, making aid more owned and delivered by governments themselves. That itself kind of fell apart a bit. And then just to say that what we see now today is a period of multipolarity. So if you're a realist, you think about this world order as individual nation states collaborating only in their self-interest. In the period from the 60s to the fall of the Soviet Union, we had a bipolar world order. We then entered a period in which, putatively, it was really Pax Americana. And today, we don't really have a Pax Americana in the same way. We have an erosion of Pax Americana and an erosion of this liberal world order. And most people will call it a period of turbulence or multipolarity, in which we've got lots of different nations jockeying for alliances and position, alongside the rise of many, many illiberal states. By that, I mean autocratic states that don't follow the pattern of liberal democracy at all. And those states, especially I might say China, are advancing development models that are very different from those that rose up in this sort of period of compensatory embedded liberalism. And those models actually have a lot of purchase in low-income and middle-income countries, because they see models like China's model as ones that may allow them to sort of leapfrog from one kind of development or economic situation to another. And I think overall, what we're going to see going forward is that aid itself, in a context of multipolarity, it's going to likely become more geopolitically motivated rather than less so, and that the opportunities for multilateralism will probably shrink. That's my prediction. I'm not a futurist, but that's my prediction. So just to say that we look around and we could see a host of problems in global coordination. It's not only in education. We have failures in coordination in trade and economic regulation, in climate, peace, of course, in migration, in information privacy. All of these are areas where, if one looks very rationally at world order, you would imagine countries coming together effectively to create international institutions, processes, norms that can actually address these areas, but actually it's been turned out to be super difficult to find methodology that allows states to coordinate on these areas. And climate change, of course, maybe peace is prominent now, but I think climate change is the greatest challenge, I think, in global coordination, and the one that has seen surprisingly limited advance. Just to say then, for education, we've talked about this embedded liberalism, this idea of embedding liberal democratic states in a global governance architecture that has long been the social imaginary of Western countries, not necessarily shared by everybody else, an increasingly multipolar world, and then failures of coordination. And I won't say too much about it, but the fact of the matter is that this differentiation between the educational life chances in low-income and fragile states, conflict-affected states, and also within middle-income and high-income states is really something that, so far, in my view, the international architecture has had a very difficult and very rocky experience in addressing. Okay, I'm going to take a quick breath there.
Thank you. What a fascinating, sort of insightful thing, because we knew about all of these small little pieces of knowledge, but to bring together such a complex history, this has been great. There is one comment from Amna, and I'll ask others if they have their comments to please share. Amna says that she feels aid is almost always geopolitically motivated, and it's rare to see a country providing aid to another without some sort of self-interest. Would you like to respond to that, Karen?
So it's a really good observation, and I tend to always try to take the best from constructivist and realist conceptualizations of how world order works. So we can look back in history and we can find examples in which this social structure of cooperation actually evolved very quickly. And probably we can think about some areas like the right to vote for women, for example, that spread like a social movement worldwide. What I would say is that international actors, nation states, were re-socialized to do things differently through an international architecture. And I think for foreign aid, if we look at it very carefully, what we'll see is that there were efforts to make sort of, what should I say, fundamental changes in the way aid was delivered, especially in the 2000s, to make it more harmonized, aligned to country needs, owned by countries that were very substantive. It was not, I think, a huge success, but I think it gave us a taste for what could happen with greater coordination. And then also to say, you know, it was very interesting when bilateral aid organizations first formed in the 60s, right? Was when like Canadian International Development Agency, the Swedish, the US, the UK, we all developed these international development agencies. They first went out there very independently, but gradually over the course of the 70s, and remember, in the context of the Cold War, educational aid became more multilateralized. And one might think, so the counterfactual is, yes, it's geopolitically motivated, but if it was only geopolitics, why multilateralize so much of it in these periods? So I think there's a bit of constructivism, a bit of gain to be had in terms of formalized cooperation and multilateralism, and we should look back on that. We shouldn't just say, oh, well, that was just superficial. But of course, the underlying question is, how do you balance geopolitical interest with the need for global goods, global public goods, like peace, like an address to climate, like universalizing literacy? How do you balance geopolitics with these common goods? And it's not an easy answer. Yeah, but I wouldn't be totally pessimistic. I guess that's how I see it.